Okay, well, the second best team in the league, a lot of people might still point to Chicago, but didn't have the best tournament weekend, particularly against the Florida Mutineers. Brother versus brother. Oh, the storylines, Katie. My gosh. Can we not script a better Hollywood film than Pristini versus Arcides, right? Oh.
No,
incredible. Well, from a gameplay perspective, though, let's go through that semifinal. It was 2-0 Chicago, and then
and then the reverse sweep happens. It was both semifinals were a reverse sweep. So of course, Atlanta coming back to reverse sweep Minnesota, and Chicago coming back to not to be reverse swept, rather by Florida to move on. But I think it was interesting to see Florida, and this is something that worries me with them is consistency issues. Because we saw on Saturday an extremely lackluster Havoc, an extremely lackluster Pristini. Havoc in, I think, their first series went 9-30 on an Azir hardpoint. That's abysmal. That's horrible. Pristini wasn't much better. Pristini went double negative, but then you see them come out on Sunday and take down Chicago. So I think Florida has what it takes. They have a very high ceiling. But if they can consistently start to reach that ceiling, is a totally different thing. As for Chicago, you look at them, and they came out flat both days. They didn't look good on Saturday. They almost lost on Saturday, going all the way to a Game 5, round 10, I believe. I believe it was a round 11 that they barely managed to clutch out and to win. But you look at Chicago, and my concerns for them primarily are a vibes issue, if you will. That team has certain players on it who, when they feel great and when they are happy, it shows and they perform and they're unified. If things start to go wrong, you watch that structure, that team energy, the synergy, the communication crumble. So my biggest concern for Chicago has always been when they face adversity, like they've finally faced in Atlanta, do they recover from that? Do they bounce back? Or does that start causing seeds of chaos internally with the team? That'll remain to be seen. I would still put Chicago as my second place team. For sure, but it was kind of disappointing. They looked very flat the entire week.
What do you attribute that to? Like in talking with Scump and talking with Arcides, it almost sounded like they sort of glossed over every other opponent and was dialed into Atlanta, just assuming that final would happen. Do you think that played too much of a part there, and they weren't necessarily focused going into this weekend?
Yes, I do, and that's kind of to the point that I just made about the vibes. So one of the other potential pitfalls for this team is assumptions. You know, if you just won the last event, they won CDL London, they're flying high. They think they're the best in the world. Who cares about these other teams, right? Of course we're going to beat them. And if there's one thing that holds true about competitive Call of Duty, it is that any team can beat any team on a given day if they are feeling themselves. And that's exactly what happened with Chicago. I think Chicago underestimated people, and they were on the receiving end of a very rude awakening from folks like Florida Mutineers who took them down. And that goes back to the whole thing. Can Chicago regain? Can they step back and say, you know what? We were kind of getting ahead of ourselves, assuming we would make it to that grand final. So time to buckle down and keep on working. I hope so. I expect so. They have a ton of veterans, a ton of winners on that team. So I think that they will bounce back. But yes, I believe that Seth, Scump, and some of the other players, they assumed that they were going to be there without realizing they actually had to get there.
Do you think that they are happy to have the next tournament off? And to have their next competitive event be Dallas? Do you think that extra amount of time will let them take a step back? Or do you think they wish they were just itching to get back at it and prove that they're the best? Where do you think their heads are at?
I'm not sure if they'll necessarily like the break. So the breaks are great, and they're also a negative, right? When you're on a break, you have time to scrim. You have tons of time to scrim, to go over VODs, to work with your coach, to polish out the issues in domination or S&D or hardpoint or whatever it may be. However, you are losing a weekend of competing on LAN against the other teams, which in and of itself is phenomenal practice. I mean, take Dallas Empire, for example. They have had the most brutal CDL schedule of any team. They've had to play Chicago 3 different times. They've had to play Atlanta. But the good thing about that is that you watch them on LAN at those events consistently getting better because they were in those high-stakes, high-pressure scenarios. So yes, having those 2-week break, it's a great way to collect yourself, get things back together, talk with your team, get on the same page. But at the same time, you are losing that improvement you would receive out of competing at an